Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Teaching the Slave Narrative, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, an online professional development seminar from America in Class from the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get underway, I'd like to take a minute or two to introduce you to the National Humanities Center and to clear up some housekeeping matters. First of all, the center is located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. Let me see if I can describe that in plain English for you. First of all, we're independent. That means we're a private nonprofit organization. We're an institute for advanced study. That means that the main program here is a fellowship program that brings scholars from this country and abroad to the center for an academic year to research and write topics in the humanities: history, literature and language studies, philosophy, criticism of the arts, those kinds of subjects. We opened in 1978, and since then about 1,300 scholars have conducted research here, and that research has resulted in about 1,300 books. Now, the place may sound like an ivory tower, and from these pictures it could pass as an ivory tower. We even have a white spiral staircase running right up through the middle of the building, but the founders didn't want it to be an ivory tower. They wanted it to connect with all sorts of audiences beyond the world of the academy, and they were particularly interested in connecting with teachers. And we do that in a variety of ways. If you want to find out what they are, go to americainclass.org, and you'll land on this page. And from this page, you can have access to all of the resources and programs we offer teachers. Now, let me remind you that at the end of this seminar, you will be able to go to the seminar website. There you will find a recording of the seminar, plus the PowerPoint. Please feel free to plunder that PowerPoint for your own classes. On the website, you will also find an evaluation. We ask you to please fill that out and submit it to us. You can fill it out and submit it online. It will just take a few minutes. It's very important to us. We pay attention to what you tell us. We try to improve the programs based on what we see in the evaluations. Once we receive that from you, we will send you a letter that you will be able to present to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in the seminar warrants. Now, let me describe how the seminar will work tonight. Professor Carretta will be making some remarks, and from time to time we'll be stopping to examine excerpts from Equiano's life. We will be posing discussion questions, and we'll be looking for your responses and comments. And the way you can send them to us is to put your cursor in the area that I have bracketed in green there on the screen. Type your message, hit send, that button to the right, and your message will appear in the text box above your send box. I'll be paying attention to the chat, and I will be bringing it into the conversation at various times throughout the evening. Now, let's get underway. We have three goals for our seminar this evening. We want to explore the historical significance of Equiano's autobiography. We want to explore Equiano the man and his times. We want to talk about the literary value of Equiano's autobiography. So we're going to explore Equiano the author. And we're also going to talk about the literary influence of Equiano's autobiography on the subsequent development of the slave narrative genre. Now, our understanding tonight is rather complex. I want to point out that Gustavus Vassa, or Olaudah Equiano, was the first successful professional author of African descent in the English-speaking world. His interesting narrative is many things. It is a spiritual autobiography, a captivity narrative, a travel book, adventure tale, slavery narrative, economic treatise, apologia, argument against the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, and perhaps, in part, historical fiction. This is the understanding we want to get across this evening. Equiano established many of the literary conventions employed in subsequent African-American slave narratives. So we want to get across the seminal nature of what you're going to be seeing tonight. Historians, literary critics, and the general public have increasingly recognized Equiano as unquestionably the most accomplished author of African descent of his times, and one of the most accomplished writer of any times. Now, we had some good questions on the forum this evening. How does Equiano present himself in the narrative? Why does he assume the persona he does? Is he a reliable narrator? How does his narrative relate to that of Frederick Douglass? And how can we be sure that Equiano wrote the narrative? To help us thread through all of these questions, we're very pleased to have with us tonight Vincent Carretta, Professor of English at the University of Maryland and a National Humanities Center Fellow in 1983-84. Vin specializes in 18th century transatlantic historical and literary studies. He's the author of more than 100 articles and reviews, and he has also written and edited 11 books, and he has written extensively on Equiano. He wrote Olaudah Equiano, The Interesting Narrative and Other Writings. He edited that, and his most recent books are the authoritative Equiano the African, a biography of a self-made man, and the Life and Letters of Philip Wheatley, the first African Anglican missionary, which he co-edited with Ty M. Reese, and then finally, Phyllis Wheatley, a biography of a genius in bondage. So let me turn the program over now to Vin, and we can learn more about the interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano. Vin, it is all yours.
Thank you, Richard, and welcome everyone. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about someone that I've been working with and on for the past almost 20 years, my hero Equiano. As Richard said, he's widely recognized as the founder of what became the African American slave narrative. He's an interesting historical figure in his own right, and I thought we might begin by looking at the frontispiece to his book, his autobiography, to talk about how he presents himself initially, the first thing that his readers would have seen when they opened the book. So if we go to that.
Okay, Vin, there you go, you can move it. And Vin, could you speak up a little louder, please?
Sure. Let me, is this loud enough?
Let me see, how do we feel? Is that loud enough, folks? Let me know. Send me a message. Yes? Okay. That's
right.
Good, Vin. If we just maintain that level, I think everybody's going to hear. Remember, these folks are all over the country.
All right, I will try to speak louder. Let me start with the frontispiece. And you notice what you see is a very well-dressed man who's obviously of African descent. He's holding out a book. He's looking directly at his readers. Now, this is quite unusual at the time to have a person of African descent looking directly out from a portrait at his viewers. And the book is not his autobiography. The book is the Bible. And he has it open to Acts 4, verse 12, which I can paraphrase as, salvation is by faith alone. So the first thing that his readers would have seen would suggest to them that this is going to be a spiritual autobiography, which in part it is. That's probably the best way to describe the framing narrative that he gives to us. And if we look at the title page, The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa the African, written by himself. The many words in this title are significant. Interesting, for example, means not only curious, that is provoking curiosity, but it also intended, I'm sure, to mean that it's of interest to us. In other words, that we are interested parties in it. To the extent that it's a spiritual autobiography, the spiritual quest and transition that he undergoes, he intends to be a model for what we undergo. We tend to think of this book as primarily a slave narrative. As his frontispiece would suggest, he might have thought of it as primarily a spiritual autobiography. The statement that's written by himself is an authenticity claim. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and talk about Frederick Douglass here, because what Equiano is doing is establishing a number of the conventions that we will see in 19th century African American narratives. And written by himself, you'll see in a number of those 19th century narratives, a different version of this would be having a white editor or amanuensis, someone who had transcribed the text of the 19th century author, certifying that this was the true life of the author. Then Equiano follows it with a biblical epigraph. And again, if you look at 19th century narratives, it's very standard to have an epigraph of poetry. And I'll mention other items that Equiano uses that are repeated or adopted in the 19th century. Should we move on?
Well, Vin, before we move on, let me ask a question. I think I'm curious about, and I think perhaps maybe many of the participants are too. Why does he have two names? Why is it Equiano and Gustavus Vasa?
That's a good question. He has a dual identity because he claims that he was born in Africa and that he was named, his African name is Olaudah Equiano, and once he was taken out of Africa, according to him, and he was purchased by Michael Henry Pascal in Virginia. Pascal was a lieutenant in the Royal British Navy. Pascal renamed him Gustavus Vasa, which is the name of a Swedish 16th century Swedish patriot who had overthrown the Danish tyrants and took the throne of Sweden for himself. So it's a kind of ironic name, or at least initially an ironic name, of someone who was a heroic figure. And then, of course, he identifies himself as the African, not simply an African. He's the first person, author of African descent, to refer to himself as the African rather than an African. So he's presenting us immediately with his dual identity. And then again, if we look at the frontispiece, let's go the other direction, we see, in a sense, the same dual identity of a black man in European clothing, the combination of the African and the British identity that he asserts.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here in the chat. First of all, is Equiano a Latin name, or that's an African name, right?
He says it's an African name. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to tell what the origin of that name is. There have been various guesses. Some people, there have been suggestions that it has a Latin base, but that would be inconsistent with his claim of an African origin.
I see. And did he have a preference as to which name he would be called by?
He never used the name Equiano until he was just before he published his autobiography. Prior to that, he always used the name Gustavus Vasa. Gustavus Vasa remained his legal name. It's the name that he married under. It's the name on his will. So, in a sense, Olaudah Equiano is his pen name.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could we go back to the frontispiece for a moment, just for 1 second? I had a question about that. I'm sorry, the title page. I'm sorry, the title page. One thing. At the bottom there, it says printed for and sold by the author. What, is that an assertion like written by himself? Is that unusual, or was that a common publishing practice at this time?
This was unusual. This is an indication of what a great businessman he was. What was normally the practice in the 18th century is that you would offer your book to a bookseller. They would try to sell it. If it did sell, that meant that the copyright was worth something, and you sold the copyright to a bookseller, and you lost all control over it. Equiano had owned the copyright for his book. He never sold it through 9 editions between 1789, the first edition, and 1794. This is the last edition published during his life. And so he kept all of the profits. This was risky to do, but it meant that he invested in himself, in his own identity, and his life was his capital.
Mm-hmm. I see. We have a question here. Could you speak a little more about what he was seeking to assert by calling himself the African as opposed to an African? That really does seem an amazing assertion. I am the African. What was he getting at there?
Well, I think what he's trying to do, and this comes out in the book itself, I think, that he is offering himself as a spokesman for all Africans. Because when this book was published, first in 1789, there was a movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. And both sides of both the opposition to the abolition of the slave trade and the proponents of the abolition of the slave trade were saying in 1788, 1789, just before his book came out, that what was needed was the voice of a victim of the transatlantic slave trade, a victim of the Middle Passage. In fact, the pro-slavery people argued that since there were no people who were giving first-person accounts, that itself was proof that the Middle Passage was in effect a kind of luxury cruise with all expenses paid to a Caribbean life of guaranteed employment and universal health care. And so the anti-slavery people sought a voice to speak for all Africans. And Equiano, in his autobiography, increasingly kind of widens the scope of identification that he makes from initially Africans from what's now Nigeria to all of Africa, to speak for all of the people who had been enslaved, to give voice to all of those people who lacked the voice themselves.
I see. Now we have a question here about copyrights again. Was it uncommon for authors during that time to own their copyrights? You said that it was uncommon for them to own their copyrights. Is that correct?
What normally happened is they would initially have the copyright, what we would call a copyright. They would register it with the stationer's company. But as soon as it seemed to have a readership, an audience, they would sell it because then it had value. And once they sold it, there were no royalties, as we understand royalties. Once you sold it, that's it. You lost all control of it. One of the reasons this is important for Equiano is that he published 9 editions of this book. He made changes in every edition. And since we know that he owned the copyright, we know that he controlled every word in those editions. With a lot of authors in the 18th century, once they sold their copyright, we can't say with much certainty what responsibility the author had for any changes. Normally it meant he had no, or she had no control over those changes. Another thing that it tells us, if we go to the frontispiece again, in the frontispiece, you can't quite make it out here, but the artist who designed it is named Denton, and the artist who engraved it was also, like Denton, someone who was just beginning a prestigious career. So Equiano also, not only was he sort of betting on himself as an author, he was betting on the artists that he employed to produce his frontispiece portrait. And both of those artists are among his original subscribers.
Okay, and we have another question here about the book's publication. Was this published simultaneous to a speaking tour?
No, the speaking tours followed. And Equiano was an early pioneer in book sales. He conducted book tours throughout England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland in the 18th century during his lifetime, going around selling copies of his books. Again, this is one of the ways he maintained control over the distribution of the story of his life and over the profits.
Mm-hmm. Now, how old was he in this frontispiece picture?
He says he was born in 1745, and this is 1789. So
in his
40s.
40s. Right. Now, we have another question here in the chat, and you may want to address this now, you may want to hold off on it, but where did Equiano learn to read and write?
Okay, that's a question that often comes up. One of the slides mentions, or is his account of his desire to learn to read and write when he sees his fellow shipmate, Richard Baker, who was another boy, a few years older than Equiano, opening a book, and Equiano holds it up, speaks to it, and listens to it, expecting it to talk back to him. Now, many people have wondered and doubted whether Equiano would have had access to literacy, but he was the slave of Pascal, who, as I said, was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, and he served under Pascal throughout what we know as the French and Indian War, what in Europe was the 7 Years' War, from 1754 till 1762. He was with Pascal, and a number of the ships that Pascal served on were the largest ships in the Royal Navy. And the largest ships in the Royal Navy all had schools, because all of the largest ships had boys, that is, boys who were under 12 years old, who were in training to become officers. And the schools on those ships were open to anybody on the ship. And so Equiano had access to those schools. He also tells us about people who were helping him learn to read and write, fellow crewmen in the Royal Navy. So he had ample opportunity to learn how to read and write.
Okay, well, shall we move on then?
Okay. One of the genres that we don't usually talk about with the interesting narrative is the petition. This, to the Lords spiritual and temporal and the commons of the Parliament of Great Britain, my lords and gentlemen, permit me with the greatest deference and respect to lay at your feet the following genuine narrative, the chief design of which is to excite your august assemblies, a sense of compassion for the miseries which the slave trade has entailed on my unfortunate countrymen. By the horrors of that trade, I was first torn away from all the tender connections that were dear to my heart, but these, through the mysterious ways of Providence, I ought to regard as infinitely more than compensated by the introduction I have thence obtained to the knowledge of the Christian religion, and of a nation which, by its liberal sentiments, its humanity, the glorious freedom of its government, and its proficiency in arts and sciences, has exalted the dignity of human nature. Now, this petition to the members of the House of Lords and Commons was, in the first edition, followed immediately the title page. So we go from seeing it, that frontispiece, which sort of pushes us towards a spiritual autobiography, to this petition, which pushes us towards an anti-slave trade argument. And his second paragraph, I am sensible I ought to entreat your pardon for addressing to you a work so wholly devoid of literary merit, but as a production of an unlettered African who is actuated by the hope of becoming an instrument towards the relief of his suffering countrymen, I trust that such a man pleading in such a cause will be acquitted of boldness and presumption. Here, the second paragraph is of great interest to me, because he's adopting what we might call the humility topos, that the claim that his book has no literary merit, production of an unlettered African. Unlettered means that he was not formally educated in Cambridge or Oxford. And in reference to his suffering countrymen, here you see the way that he's using African, that he is this representative African, speaking for all his countrymen, meaning all Africans, and that he'll be acquitted of boldness and presumption. Well, one of the things he's doing here is asserting his British identity because that's what justifies his addressing the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and the Commons of the Parliament of Great Britain. So it's an interesting identity claim. He's both African, they're his countrymen, and by implication, the British politicians are his countrymen. So he can address them in favor of his African countrymen.
We have a question here. What kind of response did Equiano receive to this petition?
The petition his petition was immediately followed in the first edition by the list of subscribers, 311 subscribers to his first edition. And that list is headed by the Prince of Wales. And in effect, what he's doing with that is both demonstrating the popularity of his book that he initially sold as by subscription, and that all of these subscribers, by implication, are fellow petitioners. They're also he's aligning them with his petition to Parliament. Now, he had a great influence. If you look at all 9 editions, in every edition he adds more subscribers. So this list of petitioners supporting the cause of trying to abolish the transatlantic slave trade just keeps growing and growing and growing.
Okay, Ben, could you comment on the role he assumes here? He's very humble here. He is petitioning. Could you comment on his rhetorical strategies here? How is he figuring out his audience, and why is he saying some of the things he's saying here?
It was standard to adopt the persona of a humble petitioner, especially if you're African. You don't expect someone to be petitioning as an African. As we read his autobiography, I think we come to see that he certainly does not believe that his book is devoid of literary merit. It has many literary allusions, many ways in which he displays his education, and again, this is a sort of thing that you would see from anyone writing. Any author that you would not expect to be writing to the Parliament, members of Parliament. You would find this typically with a woman author or with an author who was of a lower social standing.
And we have another question here. Was it Equiano's intention to appeal to politicians or social reformers or both? So what audience, beyond the Parliament, what audience is he aiming at?
Well, again, his subscribers give us a pretty good indication of the audience that he was aiming at. And they range from members of the royal family down to, my favorite name on the list is Mrs. Hogflesh, about whom I've been able to find nothing. But he also includes a couple of fellow Africans or people of African descent, a couple of people of African descent who were authors. John Wesley, the great Methodist minister, was one of his original subscribers. And in fact, Wesley was reading Equiano's autobiography on his deathbed when Wesley died in 1791. So we have a complete range of people from the very top of society to all the literate levels of society down to common people. One of the things that I've tried to do is to identify all of the subscribers through all 9 editions, and you find people who were shopkeepers, booksellers, important abolitionists like Granville Sharp. So it's the full range of English society.
I think we have a question here kind of related to that. Clearly, Equiano was a reader of the Bible. What impact did this have on the readers of his book? I imagine that really connected with this wide-ranging audience because, of course, they were all also very familiar with the Bible.
Right. The Bible is the one text that he could assume all of his readers were familiar with. And this is very much a tale of conversion. The passage that he's pointing to in Acts 4, verse 12, that's the passage that later in his book, he tells us that when he was in Cadiz, Spain, he woke up one morning, he felt a kind of inner spiritual urge, and he suddenly thought of that passage in the book, in the Bible, and that was his new birth. And so for him, for the frontispiece demonstrates the significance of the Bible for him. The Bible was absolutely crucial to almost all of the early writers of African descent because it's access to the Bible. It's the emphasis, the Protestant emphasis on direct access to the Bible that is the motivation for literacy. That's why literacy became so widespread in England, because you needed to be able to read the Bible.
Right, and we have a few more questions here about the publication of the book and the dissemination of it, and then we've really got to move on. Very quickly, how did the subscription model work? If you subscribed to it, did you get, that edition, or did you get subsequent editions? How did that model work?
You would subscribe to the one particular edition, and typically the way it worked is you would put up half the money up front, so you would be capitalizing the author. By the time Equiano published his book by subscription, subscription was out of favor because too many people had been ripped off by authors who promised a book, who would collect the upfront money, and then the book never appeared. So Equiano was taking a risk in gathering subscribers for the book. Some authors couldn't get enough subscribers to publish the book. This was the case with Phyllis Wheatley, for example, another famous woman of African descent who could not find enough subscribers in Boston to publish her book of poetry, and subsequently had to publish it in England, in London in 1773, and without subscribers, she published it with a patron, the Countess of Huntingdon, who was one of Equiano's subscribers.
Mm-hmm. And another question here before we move on. Did his addressing of Parliament affect the sales of the book in any way, or is that kind of a pro forma thing, or what?
Well, it wasn't a pro forma thing. It was rare to address
Parliament.
He's doing this, as I say, as a petition.
Mm-hmm.
It probably helped sales of the book because he's targeting a number of prospective readers. From the beginning, from the frontispiece, people who would be interested in the spiritual autobiography, because one person's spiritual autobiography should be applicable to everyone else, because there's a kind of pattern of what one goes through in a conversion and embracing Christianity. And this appeal should appeal to people who were opposed to the transatlantic slave trade. He hits a number of things. Just as the book is multi-generic, he has multiple audiences that he's after.
Okay. One final question before we move on, and we really must. Was the humility topos a feature in the 19th century slave narrative?
It's not in the same way. Now, I'm not an expert on the 19th century slave narrative. To the extent that I am on 18th century writings. In the 19th century slave narratives, you often have a white editor or amanuensis transcriber between the reader and the author. And so that person does not take a humble position. They may say that the author, that is the African, the former slave, was, of course, in a very humble social position, and this is very much emphasized in these in the 19th century slave narratives. One of the huge differences that we need to remember between 18th century writings by people of African descent and 19th century writings by people of African descent is that in the 18th century, freedom is a memory. These are people who have been taken from Africa, or say they've been taken from Africa, from a state of freedom. In the 19th century, freedom is a hope, is a goal. They're not born into freedom, so they're born into a humble situation. In the 18th century, they're humbled.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make it clearer?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Okay, we've got just shy of an hour. I think we should move on to some other points you want to make. And again, if you could speak up a little bit, that would be very helpful.
All right, sorry. Okay, shall we look at here's another example of his humility topos. I offer here the history of neither a saint, a hero, nor a tyrant. I believe there are a few events in my life which have not happened to many. It is true the incidents of it are numerous, and did I consider myself an European, I might say my sufferings were great. I like this because it's a nice kind of put down of his English readers, that implying that they could not have dealt with what he had to deal with and what slaves have to deal with. That if he were a European, he would be whining, but as an African, he's a stronger person than the over-civilized Europeans. But when I compare my lot with that of most of my countrymen, I regard myself as a particular favorite of heaven and acknowledge the mercies of Providence in every occurrence of my life. Again, this comes out very much throughout the narrative because he is a fortunate slave, if that's not a contradiction in terms. But relatively speaking, he is fortunate. He does get access to literacy. He learns things while he's in the Royal Navy. He learns how to measure, how to quantify. He learns mathematics. He learns how to read and write, so that when he becomes a slave in the Caribbean, he's much too valuable to be put out in the fields, which are in effect killing fields in terms of mortality rates, in the West Indies, because his owners recognized that they'd profit more from him by using him as a clerk, for example, or using him as someone who would go around the Caribbean and up to North America in charge of the cargoes that they were selling. And so this gave him a perspective that most slaves did not have, that 98% of slaves didn't have. And because of this perspective, when he was a slave, and then when he was a free man, and he was serving on merchant vessels traveling around the world, he's enabled to do what we might call a comparative study of slavery systems in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in North America, in, for example, Philadelphia, and in Georgia and South Carolina. And he creates a kind of hierarchy of horror of these various slave systems. We tend to think of slavery as monolithic, and that Americans especially tend to think of slavery in terms of the plantation model in the 19th century. But Equianos' accounts show us that slavery is very widespread, very different kinds of slavery throughout the 18th century world.
We have a couple of questions here. Did Equiano face any sort of backlash for being outspoken about his experiences, especially the passages about the horrors of the Middle Passage?
We don't have evidence that he suffered a backlash there was an attempt to discredit him by claiming that he was neither African nor British, that he was actually born in the Danish West Indies. And he immediately responded to that in print. We don't have any accounts of his being attacked by people after he published his book. We do have, he was quite a brave man. He went to Bristol and Liverpool, which were the centers of the transatlantic slave trade, to sell copies of his book. And he has a Bristol subscription list. And before he went to Bristol, he wrote to Josiah Wedgwood, the famous Wedgwood of Chinaware, asking him for a contact in Bristol if he ran into trouble. Wedgwood was out of town, so by the time he responded, Equiano had gone to Bristol and returned, and had clearly survived and had gathered subscribers. But this took serious courage to do that, because we have white abolitionists who talk about how terrified they were to go to places like Bristol and Liverpool to support the cause of abolition, and they felt physically threatened and endangered.
Mm-hmm. We have another question here too. Who were the friends who requested the writing of this book? In fact, were there any friends, or is this part of the humility topos that he's engaging in here?
This is a reference to the "I am not so foolishly vain as to expect from it either immortality or literary reputation, if it affords any satisfaction to my numerous friends at whose request it has been written."
Right.
That is standard humility.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to sound vain. You want to sound, and you'll find this. Phyllis Wheatley says the same sort of thing. White authors say the same sort of thing. Especially women authors, you'll see saying this kind of thing, that I wasn't going to publish it, but my friends so insisted that I do, or so strongly encouraged me. Or the other thing that you'll see is someone saying, well, I did not intend to publish it, but this so-and-so was going to publish it, so I wanted to get it out first in the proper state.
Right, so he's very much a sophisticated author. I mean, he knows literary conventions of his day.
That he does indeed.
Okay, we have another question here. Which slavery system did he consider to be the most horrific?
The most horrific was in the West Indies,
mm-hmm.
followed closely by South Carolina and Georgia. And we need to keep in mind that South Carolina was settled by West Indian slave owners, so that the slave codes, the slave laws in South Carolina were modeled on those in Barbados and the West Indies. But those were the worst places to be slaves. If you're going to be a slave, it would be much better. Well, England was the best place to be a slave in general. That doesn't mean that there weren't horrible conditions for particular slaves. But as a system, slavery was worse. The greater proportion of slaves to whites, and that's kind of standard rule, because the greater the proportion of slaves, the more violence the whites used to keep them suppressed.
Okay, well, shall we move on then?
Sure.
Is there any other comments about the middle passage? Okay.
Okay. Should we talk about the middle? Well, let me talk about the practicing circumcision like the Jews.
Sure.
We practiced circumcision like the Jews and made offerings of peace on that occasion in the same manner as they did. Like them also, our children were named from some event, etc. And then we go down to the next paragraph. I have before remarked that the natives of this part of Africa are extremely cleanly. This necessary habit of decency was with us a part of religion, and therefore we have many purifications and washings, indeed almost as many, and used on the same occasions, if my recollection does not fail me, as the Jews. He talks about Jews frequently in his narrative, several times. He compares Africans to Jews, not just these passages, but elsewhere as well. And one of the and we need to, it's important to stress that he's talking about Old Testament Jews, not 18th century Jews, because Old Testament Jews did not have the opportunity to embrace Christianity, whereas contemporaneous Jews to Protestants like Equiano had rejected the opportunity to embrace Christianity. But what the primary thing I think he's up to here is to normalize Africans for his English-speaking audience, to counter the images of Africans as primitive, as so totally alien, as having kind of savage religions, and that to suggest that they were like the Old Testament Jews, they believed in, they were monotheistic, that they had similar practices, that they were ready to be converted to Christianity. They were right at the point that Jews were before Christ appeared. And so to make his audience, his English audience, feel that these Africans were very close to them as human beings.
So this is trying to break down that wall of otherness and develop sympathy in his audience.
Right, right. In effect, and he says this explicitly about some other things about certain kinds of technological advances, that we Europeans were at this stage earlier in their own cultural development. So rather than, in the 19th century, you have people arguing that Africans are inherently inferior to Europeans. You don't find that very often in the 18th century. What you'll find in the 18th century is the argument that Africans are at an earlier stage of cultural and technological development. In the 18th century, the English said the same thing about the Irish and the Scots, that they were like Africans in that they were just not as advanced. It wasn't because they were inherently incapable of advancing, but because they simply historically had not reached the point of where the English were. And of course, they thought the English were the most advanced possible.
Okay. Well, we have a note here. One participant is asking, referring to Phyllis Wheatley. She does a similar thing, right? When she refers to pagan land in some of her poems.
Yes, she doesn't develop it to the extent that Equiano does. She rarely talks about. Well, she basically never talks about Africa in the way Equiano does. She doesn't recount life in Africa in her letters or in her poems. So Africa for her is more of a concept that she has moved beyond. She doesn't really talk about Africa as kind of set up for Christianity, that they're on the verge of Christianity, that Africans are monotheistic, that they have many of the same religious practices. She does none of that. So Equiano is very different from Phyllis Wheatley in those ways.
Okay, we have a very good question here. Is the concept of the noble savage in this passage intentional, or would his readers have conjured up this image?
The noble savage, in the 18th century, they would take out the savage. Most of the authors of African descent, or very many of the authors of African descent in the 18th century claimed a noble lineage in Africa or a royal lineage in Africa. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that in the 18th century, in Britain, it was very much a hierarchical society, so that someone who was royalty in Africa would have been socially equivalent to royalty in England. This sounds very strange to Americans usually, because in the 19th century, what's happened with slavery is it has democratized in a very bad way all people of African descent, so that you don't have royal Africans or noble Africans in 19th century plantation slavery. But in the 18th century, you do have, and I could talk about specific historical figures who are treated as royalty, Africans who are treated as royalty in Britain. This never happened in North America or in the West Indies.
Okay, so we're getting a sense of his rhetorical strategy here. He tells us he's Christian, he's humble. Now in this passage, he's telling us that he's civilized, just like the Jews. Shall we move on to see how else he develops his case?
Okay. Well, this is the famous middle passage that is used cited by historians all the time. And the question of whether, one of the questions is he a reliable narrator? One of the forum questions. And this question takes on a lot of weight when we raise the issue of his birthplace. Was he born in Africa, or was he born in South Carolina, as his baptismal and naval records say? Because if he was born in South Carolina, he didn't experience the Middle Passage. And so for historians who use this as their classic first-person account of the Middle Passage, it undermines its usefulness to them. But if you think of Equiano as writing as the African, the voice of the voiceless, the person who has access to literacy and to print that all those millions of fellow Africans did not have, then I think this becomes a much more interesting rhetorical move, because there are different levels of truth, if you will. There's a kind of capital T truth in which this account of the Middle Passage is true in that sense, whether he lived it or not. This is a true account of how horrible that situation was. And I'm thinking of the small t truth to refer to whether he, Equiano, personally experienced this. So that's an issue that students love to talk about. What do we do with this passage if he was born in South Carolina? Does this passage render him a great literary artist if it did not happen to him personally, and yet for 200 years everyone was convinced that he did experience it because he describes it so compellingly?
Well, then, if he had been born in South Carolina, would there be other sources that he could have read about the Middle Passage, or were they just, at this point, did they just not exist? I mean, if there were no other sources, is this a work of imagination here, or were there sources that he might have referred to?
There were all other sources. They were all written by whites.
Uh-huh.
They were, a number of them were written by whites who had been engaged in the slave trade and then turned against it. For example, John Newton of Amazing Grace fame,
mm-hmm.
who had been a slave trader, a commander of a slave ship before he turned against the slave trade. and befriended Equiano, by the way. So we had accounts, and some of those accounts are fuller than his account. But as I said earlier, what the movement needed was the African's voice on this.
Okay. Well, shall we move on then?
Okay.
Now, this is the rest of the middle passage.
I think I'll let people savor the stench on their own.
Okay.
Oh, here, when we remember, we had just looked at some passages where he takes that humble pose. He adopts a humble persona that was very common. It's not just him, but listen to this voice. "O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God?" He's referring to the practice of the slave trade. "Who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you? Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends to toil for your luxury and lust of gain? Must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed to your avarice? Are the dearest friends and relations now rendered more dear by their separation for their kindred, still to be parted from each other and thus prevented from cheering the gloom of slavery with the small comfort of being together and mingling their sufferings and sorrows? Why are parents to lose their children, brothers or sisters, or husbands or wives? Surely this is a new refinement in cruelty, which, while it has no advantage to atone for it, thus aggravates distress and adds fresh horrors even to the wretchedness of slavery." Now, how humble would you describe that voice? Pardon?
No, go on, please. Go ahead.
He's calling out the Christians. What he's done is he's assumed the persona of the true Christian, speaking to these hypocrites with a series of rhetorical questions, and he even adopts biblical sounding language to an English audience. "O ye nominal," not "O you," and he's assuming a position of moral and spiritual superiority to them. He's the one who quotes the Bible or paraphrases the Bible, "Do unto men as you would men should do unto you," to them. So he's about as far from that humility topos this is very near the end of a chapter. He's about as far from that humility topos as he can get. But he feels that he's earned it because what's preceded this were those passages that we've looked at, his account of Africa, his account of the middle passage. So he's in the process of writing the book. He has earned his authority, and now he's asserting it.
Right. So we see another aspect of his rhetorical strategy here. He's earned his authority, and now he's moving away from that humility topos and really sort of getting in the nominal Christian's face. Mm-hmm. We have some questions about the question about the authenticity of the middle passage excerpt. Was the authenticity of that debated in the 18th century, or did readers just assume that was true? I mean, in the 18th century, presumably people weren't speculating as to whether or not he was born in South Carolina.
No. There are we have no record of anyone challenging the veracity of his account.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, the only evidence we have is of someone challenging his identity, not whether he wrote the book. The challenge to his identity, if he had been born in the Danish West Indies, would be a challenge to his account of the middle passage. But that's indirect. They don't address the middle passage directly, but of course, if you undermine his claim to having been born in Africa, you are undermining his claim to the authenticity of his account of the middle passage. If by authenticity we mean his personal experience of it.
Mm-hmm.
But we can talk about it as authentic, as I said, because it is true to the facts of how awful the Middle Passage was to those who suffered it.
Right, right. We have some other questions here. Is there any evidence that Harriet Beecher Stowe read this narrative?
No, we don't have evidence. The narrative was republished in the 19th century, in the early years of the 19th century. Excerpts were published through the 19th century. The odds are probably pretty good that Frederick Douglass had some familiarity with it. I'm not aware of any explicit references that he makes to it. There aren't, in his narrative, there aren't passages where we could say, aha, this is from Equiano. But again, their lives were so different. The North American slave experience was so different from the slave experiences that Equiano had.
Well, this passage does seem to resonate down into the 19th century. I'm thinking of the way it strikes a chord with Frederick Douglass. Like, for example, "What to a slave is the 4th of July." It's the same kind of tone. Maybe this is the opportunity to address one of the questions in the form. How does this narrative relate to that of Frederick Douglass?
It's that's a tough question to answer, because Equiano does establish a number of the conventions that you find in the 19th century narratives. For example, the engraved portrait, the title page with the claim to authenticity, whether it's written by himself or a reference to a white who has authorized it, the testimonials that the equivalent would be Equiano's petition subscription list, the poetic epigraph, the actual narrative itself, and the account. But the differences are also very significant. Since Equiano had been free, or tells us he had been free, and he has that, he's trying to establish a status that he's lost, or at least that he tells us he's lost. With Frederick Douglass, he's trying to create an identity, establish an identity. Look at the difference in the naming process. Equiano keeps the slave name Gustavus Vasa and reclaims or invents an African name. Look at what Frederick Douglass does. He rejects, as so many of the 19th century slave narrators do, he rejects the slave name and claims a free name, a name that emphasizes his freedom. Does that start to answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Is there evidence that Frederick Douglass was aware of Olaudah Equiano's narrative?
I haven't seen any evidence, and my colleague, who is an expert on Frederick Douglass, hasn't. At least he hasn't shared with me any.
Well, that raises an interesting question. How, if at all, how did Equiano's narrative enter the American literary stream? I mean, how did it? When did it come to this country?
Well, it came to this country in 1791 during Equiano's life. There was a pirated. Pirated means that it was published without the author's consent.
Mm-hmm.
A pirated edition published in New York City in 1791, which has its own local subscribers, list of subscribers. So there was an American edition. And then one thing that we tend to forget is we tend to think if something was published on one side of the Atlantic, it stayed on that side of the Atlantic. People in North America imported books from London. Publishing in London was like publishing in New York City today. It's where you wanted to publish because then it would be disseminated throughout the U.S. or throughout the English-speaking world in the 18th century. So even though we only know one edition that was published in America, Americans would have had access to editions published in London. And as there were several editions published after Equiano's death in London, in England, in various parts of England in the early 19th century. And then there were these excerpts. In the 19th century, there were a number of kind of collections of excerpts from writings by people of African descent. And so Equiano appears in those. People like Douglas or Stowe would have known of Equiano, whether because they would have seen these collections. These collections are kind of like Reader's Digest. So they'd have passages from a number of texts by people of African descent. Mm-hmm. So they would have very probably known of him and known some passages, but we just don't have smoking gun evidence that they read the whole narrative.
Right. We have another very interesting comment here about the cadences of Equiano's prose. Seems to be the cadence of a preacher. Do we have any aspects of the sermon here?
He does use the voice of the preacher when he feels it's appropriate. And again, you'll find this in many of the early Black authors. Many of them, or all of them actually, gain access to literacy via Christianity, and they all gain it through access to evangelical Christianity, which obligated people to, in effect, become missionaries. One of the ways that you demonstrated that you had experienced a second birth of religious conversion is that you then go out and try to convert others. So this kind of ministerial rhetoric, and cadence is a good word for the kind of rhythm that you'll find, is pretty common in the early writings of people of African descent.
Okay, well, shall we move on then? We've got about a little over 20 minutes.
All right. Well, we've touched on this before, the importance of literacy, that he saw his master and his friend employed in reading, and recognized that reading was access to the Bible, access to a kind of power. Again, this is something that comes up in African-American slave narratives in the 19th century, the recognition of how important it is to be able to read and write, to communicate to others. And in North America and in the West Indies, reading and writing, well, especially writing, was a great danger that the owners tried to keep slaves from having access to reading, but especially to writing, because that's the way you could communicate. And in England, that's not the case, probably in large part because the percentage of enslaved people was so much smaller than in the southern states or southern colonies in North America and in the West Indies. But literacy is something that comes up over and over again in 19th century's African-American slave narratives.
All right, well, shall we move on? Here we go.
Okay. This passage I find very interesting. This is in the end of chapter 5. And chapter 5 is, in many ways, Equiano's most literary chapter. It's a chapter that historians tend to completely ignore. And it's one that I don't think has been as appreciated as it should be by those of us who teach literature. This is he's ventriloquizing Beelzebub, which is very interesting because Beelzebub, of course, is a bad figure in Milton's Paradise Lost, and he's a figure of rebellion. And here again, we have Equiano asking a series of rhetorical questions. I haven't given you the whole lead up to this, but the person who observed the cadence, the religious cadence, would have noticed, I think, the same sort of cadence in the beginning of this passage. Why do you use those instruments of torture? Are they fit to be applied by one rational being to another? And are ye not, here we go with the ye's, are ye not struck with shame and mortification to see the partakers of your nature reduced so low? But above all, are there no dangers attending this mode of treatment? Are you not hourly in dread of an insurrection? Nor would it be surprising, for when no peace is given to us enslaved, but custody severe, and stripes and arbitrary punishment inflicted, what peace can we return? But to our power, hostility and hate, untamed reluctance and revenge, though slow, yet ever plotting how the conqueror least may reap his conquest, and may least rejoice in doing what we most in suffering feel. It's rhetorically very clever, the way he asks first, why do you do the things you do? Then, don't you realize the dangers that you risk? Aren't you afraid of an insurrection? So there's this threat, and then to go to Beelzebub's voice, the voice of a demon. And as soon as he ends that, he moves to, but by changing your conduct and treating your slaves as men, every cause of fear would be banished. They would be faithful, honest, intelligent, and vigorous, and peace, prosperity, and happiness would attend you. He works up to initially a kind of emancipationist, insurrectionist rhetoric and threat, and then he backs up and says, but if you change your behavior, if you ameliorate the conditions, he switches to what is arguably more of an ameliorationist tack than an emancipationist tack. So he does this a number of times in the book, that it's a kind of iron fist in a not quite a velvet glove. But earlier in this chapter, when he encounters a fellow slave who has been deceived repeatedly by whites because of course he has no recourse to justice, Equiano says, I felt like Moses with the Egyptian, redressing his countrymen with the Egyptian. And he doesn't give the biblical citation. He expects his readers to recognize what that allusion is to, and that's an allusion to Moses seeing one of his fellow Israelites mistreated by an Egyptian. Moses looks around, sees no one is watching, and he kills the Egyptian and buries him. And so there are several points in this chapter where Equiano alludes to a prior text, a literary text, whether it's a poetic text like this, Milton, or whether it's the Bible, or he uses references to some other texts, literary texts in the same chapter. He keeps coming back to this threat of violence that he doesn't quite fulfill. He backs off, or he simply alludes to it. So it's a really interesting rhetorical move that he does.
So in this passage, we have the voice of Beelzebub. This is the voice of Satan. Satan is speaking when we see, why do you use those instruments of torture? Those are Satan's words, right?
No, this is Beelzebub, who is
Beelzebub.
one of Satan's followers.
Okay, one of Satan's followers. Okay, and that question is aimed at whom? Slave owners, the readers?
Slave owners.
Slave owners. Okay. So he's making a comment about the kind of company slave owners keep.
Right.
Okay. Very sophisticated use of literary allusion here. Well, shall we move on then?
Okay. As I think I mentioned earlier, one of the things that Equiano does is give us this comparative slavery survey throughout the known world. This is when he's a free man and he's traveling. He is enlisted on a merchant ship because he has wanderlust. I think one of the reasons he has wanderlust is it's a way to reconfirm to himself and everyone else that he is a free man, that he can just take up and leave once he's free. And so he volunteers or he offers himself for an employment on merchant vessels leaving from London. And of course, he has all this Royal Naval experience, so he's much in demand as a seaman. And here he's in the Mediterranean. He goes into the Mediterranean. He says, but all this grandeur in Italy was, in my eyes, disgraced by the galley slaves, whose condition both there and in other parts of Italy is truly piteous and wretched. And then later in the same chapter, he says, I was surprised. He's now visiting Greece, which at the time was subjugated by the Turks. I was surprised to see how the Greeks are, in some measure, kept under by the Turks, as the Negroes are in the West Indies by the white people. So you see that he has, whites are enslaved in these countries. And I think part of what he's up to here is to try to create a bond of enslavement, if you will, the perspective of the enslaved, a bond between the Africans who have been enslaved and whites who are enslaved. That slavery doesn't just enslave Africans. Again, this would seem very strange to find, I think, in the 19th century, a notion that slavery is not what in the 19th century would be called race-based. It's a status that's, in a way, universal. So whites are also vulnerable to being enslaved. And it gets to, sorry.
Go ahead, please.
No, it also touches on, again, his notion that there are different kinds and degrees of slavery and involuntary servitude. The galley slaves were normally prisoners who have been sentenced to what we call hard labor for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm. So you can really see here the difference between the arguments made against slavery in the 18th century and those made in the 19th century. You're right. This is not an argument that would have been made in the 19th century once slavery had become racialized. Just a point of clarification here. Equiano had indeed achieved his freedom by the time he was traveling and was in demand as a sailor. He was a free man by that time, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. How did he gain his freedom? That question has come up once before in this session, and I didn't introduce it at the time it did because I was going to save it till the end. So let me ask now, how did he gain his freedom?
Well, when he was serving with Pascal during the 7 Years' War, he was Pascal's slave. Equiano expected to be freed at the end of that war. Pascal apparently heard that Equiano expected to be freed, took umbrage at Equiano's presumption that he would be freed, and rather than freeing him, he sent him to the West Indies to be sold. He sold him to a captain who took him to the West Indies to be sold into slavery in the West Indies at the end of 1762. And Equiano was quickly bought by a Quaker who recognized that Equiano had all of these advanced skills that he had acquired in the Royal Navy, and he set him to work as his, what we might call his overseer, because he did take charge of some shipments of slaves who were brought up to North America. He was in charge of this man's accounts and of conducting his business throughout the West Indies colonies, and then up into Philadelphia, Georgia, South Carolina. This is how he got to South Carolina, Georgia, and Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
And the Equiano bargained with his owner, and his owner agreed that if Equiano could pay him back what the owner had paid for Equiano, he would free him. And what Equiano did on these trips is he would take some private goods. He would do his own sales. Sometimes he would get ripped off by whites, but he would keep selling things, making profits, buying things, selling them for a little bit more. And within 4 years, he was able to buy his freedom from his owner. His owner wasn't too pleased that he'd come up with the money, especially that fast, but he felt honor-bound to grant him his freedom. Oh, and one of the conditions was that Equiano would continue to work as a free man for 1 year for his former slave owner.
Uh-huh. We have a question here. Is there any evidence that the Quaker who bought him knew of his reading and writing skills prior to buying him?
Yes. That's one of the reasons he bought him.
Uh-huh.
The captain who had brought him to the West Indies was told by Pascal to not to sell him to a plantation, but to find an appropriate owner who would treat him decently. Pascal and Equiano had developed, especially from Equiano's perspective, a child-parental relationship. Equiano is explicit about this. He talks about it. That one of the reasons he's so depressed by what Pascal does in selling him is because he thought they had a relationship that was familial, and that Pascal has broken that bond. But Pascal did assure that he was sold to someone who would, quotes, I guess, appreciate him more than to a plantation owner, even though Equiano tells us that someone had offered more money, but it would have been a very harsh slavery.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that in the 19th century, some slaves did buy their own freedom, but was that more common in the 18th, do you know, Vin?
Common, it depends on where you're talking about and the access they had to money. In the West Indies, it was, of course, very uncommon.
Right.
In North America, in the southern colonies in North America, it was very uncommon because people had to have some marketable skill that they could earn the money. Someone working on a plantation in the fields didn't have access to that kind of, the ability to trade anything. The people who could save money or make money on the side would be skilled craftsmen, which of course you had on every plantation and certainly in the towns. And so those people had relatively more freedom, and they did have a greater opportunity to acquire funds that they could use towards buying their freedom, assuming that their owners will let them buy their freedom. Now, and a lot of slave owners who are very opposed to the whole idea of allowing slaves to redeem themselves was the term that was used, to buy their own freedom, because it threatened the whole system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're getting on to the end of our time here. Shall we move ahead then, Vin?
Okay. Oh, this is a passage that Equiano published in the newspaper. And the reason I'm showing this is that to demonstrate the difference between the persona he takes or reveals in some of the letters that he's writing to a smaller audience than this is to a London audience than the persona that he has in the interesting narrative, where he's more careful in the interesting narrative about coming right out directly for an emancipationist position. And the interesting narrative, what I think he does is lead his readers, those readers who come to the book as essentially uncommitted on the issue of the slave trade, to lead them to the logical conclusion that they have to make and they should make, that this is an evil practice and it should be stopped. But here he's writing, he wrote a couple of what we might call variations on book reviews. And this is a response to James Tobin, who wrote several pro-slavery pamphlets. And Equiano is saying what leads up to this passage is Equiano's talking about how we can create a fairer social system in England and in the colonies. As the groundwork, why not establish intermarriages at home and in our colonies, and encourage open, free, and generous love upon nature's own wide and extensive plan, subservient only to moral rectitude without distinction of the color of the skin. That ancient, most wise, and inspired politician, Moses, notice how often he likes to invoke Moses as his model, established marriage with strangers by his own example. The Lord confirmed them and punished Aaron and Miriam for vexing their brother for marrying the Ethiopian. Away then with your narrow, impolitic notion of preventing by law what will be a national honor, national strength, and productive of national virtue, intermarriages. How can you imagine Frederick Douglass writing this, publishing this in North America in the 19th century? But Equiano can get away with it in England. And of course, he knows he's going to offend someone like Tobin, who is a racist. But one of the things Equiano does in his own autobiography from the 5th edition on, from 1792 on, is he adds a next to last paragraph in which he mentions his marriage that took place in 1792 to an English woman. So for people like Tobin, he's sort of slapping them in the face by demonstrating that he believes in intermarriage as the way to eradicate the kind of clash between white racists and blacks in England, at least.
So I take it then he did marry a white woman. Is that true?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And was this common at the time? Were there many intermarriages like that?
It was very common. Well, many poorer people didn't marry officially in England,
Mm-hmm.
but there were many black-white couples, and since there were much higher percentage of black males in England than black females, because black males were used as servants and black females were and also many owners would bring attendants over from the colonies, and since most of the owners who came over were men, they'd have male attendants. So it was very common for black men to have white partners. And we have, if you look at visual representations in the 18th century, you'll see fairly often Hogarth, for example, his print from the 1730s called Noon Shows a Black Couple. So that was quite common.
Mm-hmm. So was there any backlash, any criticism of Equiano's marriage in England?
No, again, there's no record of any objection to it. You do have some whites who objected to what in the 19th century is called miscegenation. That's not a term that you hear in the 18th century. To intermarriages. Okay.
We have a few questions here. We need to wrap this up. Was Equiano successful? Did he make a lot of money as a writer, or how did he end up financially?
He ended up as probably the wealthiest person of African descent in the English-speaking world.
Wow.
He was certainly the most famous when he died. We know this because he left. He had a will, so we know how much money he left. It would be the equivalent today of around 100,000, or now more probably.
Yeah.
And he left that to his surviving daughter, who married a white minister in the 19th century. In England, you could do that. There was never a law in England outlawing interracial marriage.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Vin, we've come to the end of the seminar. I know we have a few more passages to look at. Do you want to focus on any one before we wrap up? We've got about 4 more left here.
Okay, let's see what's left. These are the ones people talking about what the implications of the discovery of the documents that say that he was born in South Carolina. Trevor Bernard, Goodbye Equiano, the African, he takes a pretty hardcore historian's perspective on that issue. If it's not true, then we can't use it. When he says, we don't read the interesting narrative because it's well written. Well, of course, those of us who teach literature do read it because it's well written.
Yeah.
We as historians, we don't read it, moreover, in the way that Carretta seems to suggest it might now be read as an intriguing example of how an African American could become a self-made man by refashioning his identity in response to changing circumstances. Well, a lot of people in literature would say that's a fairly naive response to what Equiano is doing in his autobiography, or what anyone does in an autobiography, because any autobiography is an act of self-fashioning or self-refashioning. We read the interesting narrative because it is true. Again, that gets to the question, what do we mean by true? It's one of the things I did when I was researching the Penguin edition of the interesting narrative, is I thought I should try to verify everything that Equiano says, because it's very circumstantial. He gives lots of dates, places, names of people. And to the extent that once he's out of the Africa section, which you can't really verify, there aren't records that you can verify, he is very reliable. You can check him on all these dates and names and people. So there's a lot of truth in the interesting narrative. Bernard is concerned only with the truth of the middle passage. And again, he and I have discussed the different kinds of truth that Equiano may be playing with. And okay, that's more of him. And this is me. We've already talked about the multi-generic nature. John Sensbach is another historian, and he takes his reaction is much closer to mine. in light of Carretta's new version of Equiano's life, then the question becomes, what kind of Atlantic Creole was he? The phrase Atlantic Creole refers to a person whose identity is defined by his relationship to the Atlantic Ocean, crossing the Atlantic, that he's not simply land-bound. He's someone who is on the coast of the Atlantic, going back and forth. The answer is crucial in his own time and in ours, and African Birth validates his eyewitness claims to authenticity when describing his Igbo upbringing. But jumping down to, if on the other hand he had never been to Africa and never witnessed the Middle Passage, it becomes a very different, in some ways more complex Creole, whose memoir now calls for different readings that account for the vividness and rhetorical impact of his descriptions. Now, one of the things that some historians say about the Middle Passage episode is that it's too vivid and too rhetorically powerful not to have been true, which to those of us who teach literature, I think would say, well, really fine literature conveys vividness and rhetorical power, even if it's fictional, and we know, even if we know that it's fictional. And there's lots of evidence. I've tried to point to some of it in his interesting narrative that demonstrates that he's quite a master of rhetoric. He knows how to shift his voices, his cadences, and how to play to different audiences.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our seminar. Let me ask if there are any final questions or comments before we wrap things up this evening. This is your last shot. I don't see anything coming across the board. Here we go. He appeared to feel African first and European second. He always yearned and spoke of returning to England when in North America, and when in England it was to Africa that he wanted to return. Ben, did he ever return to Africa?
No, he tried to, well, whether it was a return or go,
he
tried to be sent to Africa. He was asked to be the commissary for the project to resettle former slaves in Sierra Leone.
Mm-hmm.
And he accepted that position. But before he could go, he was fired from it because he clashed with a white colleague who he accused, basically we would say, of skimming some of the supplies for profit. And so he never made it to Sierra Leone. He takes great pride in telling us in his narrative that he was exonerated, that Parliament voted to give him his salary, in acknowledging that he was in the right in this conflict. There's some dispute about, there's no doubt that he had probably acted properly, but he may have been a little too pushy. Well, he's certainly too pushy for some, in some people's minds at the time, some people that he politically should have placated.
Mm-hmm.
So he almost made it.
But not quite. Well, we end with two appropriate questions. Where is he buried? And any descendants today? One of our participants supplied us some answers. He is buried in England and was survived by one daughter who died in 1857. Any living descendants that we know of?
No.
No.
We don't, and we don't know exactly where his grave is. I would love to know that. But we do know where his surviving daughter's grave is. She apparently had no children. She was quite sickly for many years of her life. I've checked. This is a whole other story of tracking her down and finding a grave site, which when the day my wife and I did a kind of a little dance.
Dancing on someone's grave, are you now? Does it come to that?
Oh, near it. I would say on it. But it was quite a bit of detective work to find that. But it's very difficult to track a woman if you don't know her maiden name. And I mean, if you don't know her married name, sorry. We knew her maiden name, of course, which was Vasa, but we didn't know her married name. And what happened is I periodically would check genealogical sites, and someone in Australia sent out a note saying, we ran into, they were doing a different family, and they said, we ran into this name, Joanna Vasa. Anybody know anything about that? And I shot back, whoa, you may be the key to what I need, because they had a husband's name. They were interested in the husband. And so that gave me the last name, and that meant I could start tracking through grave cemetery records and baptismal records and church records. And she and her husband, there were no baptisms of children.
Uh-huh.
And she, as I said, I think spent the last decades of her life very sickly. So they apparently had no children. Their gravestone has her name on it, his name on it, his second wife's name on it, and on the fourth side is blank.
I see. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've gone considerably over. We do have to wrap this up. We urge you to continue to use the forum, to continue the discussion, and to share some ideas and approaches. We will monitor the forum until October 30th, and what that means is some interesting questions and comments come in. We'll pass them on to Vin, and we'll get back in touch with you. I want to thank you very much for your participation this evening and remind you, please submit your evaluations. Vin, let me thank you. This has been a really interesting and provocative seminar. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please be back. Join us again for some more seminars. Tomorrow night, we're doing one on the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, and then on October 16th, we'll be looking at consumer politics in the American Revolution. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us tonight. We hope you'll join us again soon. Thank you, and good evening.